Greetings, everyone. This is PLP Pathways webinar number 8. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about equity, personalized learning, and starting the discussion about what this looks like in the classroom and around Act 77. My name is Don Taylor, and before we go too much further, this work is sponsored by the Middle Grades Collaborative and the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education. I'd like to have our panel guests introduce themselves, and then we'll start the discussion.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Phillips. I work at the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Hallman, and I work for Up for Learning.
Hi, my name is Kevin Pioli Hunt. I'm a 5A journalist teacher on Swift House and Wilson Central School.
Hi, I'm Maura Wheeler. I am the Proficiency-Based Learning and Technology Integration Coach at Lamoille South Supervisory Union.
Hi, I'm Meg O'Donnell. I teach on the Alpha team at Shelburne Community School.
And our goal for today, we realize that equity is a very broad and complex topic, and our goal is probably not to provide answers to a lot of the questions, but to start the dialogue and start the discussion and start asking the questions around equity issues so that we can create more equitable learning environments for all students. So today we're going to provide some initial resources and strategies for educators. And I'm going to start with a quote from Chris Sturgis in his paper, Designing for Equity. He states that equity requires us to go further to create a more adaptive system that supports a personalized approach, meeting students where they are, and leverages student agency, motivation, and engagement to optimize a school's pedagogical approach so that every student has opportunity and a meaningful pathway to college and career readiness and to achieve their goals. Sturgis talks about characteristics of equitable education systems, including making sure that you have equal outcomes, that you disrupt institutional inequity and systems that are complicit in creating inequities, and that you also create inclusive environments that personalize the learning. We're going to start out with Jeannie Phillips is going to help us, and Maura are going to help us discuss how we recognize inequity and how do we actually start thinking about this issue in our classroom.
Thanks, Don. I think one of the things that seems obvious but often isn't is that before we can do anything to address inequity, we have to be able to recognize it. And the tricky thing about inequities is that we often don't question them. They seem like the status quo and normal, and it's easy to ignore them or be blind to them. And so one of the questions I like to pose is, how do we as educators become more aware of our own bias and assumptions that keep us from seeing inequitable policies and practices? Before I turn it to the panel to ask you how you might do this, I'll suggest something that's worked for me, which is this approach called an audit, where you choose something, anything, to keep track of some data and see where you're blind, what the data shows you, because sometimes it shows you what you don't want to see. So as a former and always school librarian, I started tracking about 5 years ago what I was reading and found myself reading almost exclusively white authors and mostly white women. And so I've worked really hard. That same year, I set a goal to say at least half of the books I read would be written by authors of color. And now that's super easy, but I was not aware that that was a blind spot I had. And I wasn't aware of how it was shaping my view of the world. So anybody else have thoughts on how they might address or surface bias or assumptions in their lives?
I have a quick one. In that the way I crowd manage in my classroom is often like, ladies and gentlemen, or that the way that I address the groups in front of me was so heavy gender specific. And it's a trap that I just would fall into. And so something I've been trying to be really intentional about, I slip up every now and again, but just saying, prime group or 7A, I either name the class, or I might just say people or friends or whatever it is that I'm trying to. I know it seems so simple, but I realize how dismissive using gender as a way to redirect a group of students is dismissive of entire populations. So that's something I'm mindful of.
Thanks.
I could actually build off of that, Meg. Last year I had an 8th grader who was transitioning, and he did a project on creating a GSA, and so much of it was about the language that we use. And what's, I think, great about teaching in the middle school is a lot of these students aren't afraid to call you on it and remind you, which I really appreciate, because I think as educators, one thing I really value at teaching at this level is, when you create a culture that's open where students feel comfortable with, talking to a teacher about content like this, or being on a team. I know one thing we value as teammates is, we'll oftentimes try to bring this up whenever we can at a kid talk, or just saying, like, what are we doing in terms of limiting some of these biases? And if we recognize it, brainstorming ideas, because again, it's such a big piece that I don't think we ever have a really clear answer to. But like Don had mentioned in the beginning, just the fact that I think we're acknowledging it and trying to have a conversation is at least a starting point for a lot of us. So I know that's one thing that we do is try to work it into a conversation whenever we can, as regularly, which I think we're guilty of right now. We haven't in a while, but now that we're having this conversation now, I'm excited to bring it back to the team and say, hey, like, let's look at our own practices real quick and see, what we're doing and how we can continue to improve it.
Sorry, Lindsay. I just wanted to sort of share that I do think a lot of working to recognize bias requires people to really be self-reflective and have an understanding of the cultural lens that they bring into their classroom. And I know the cultural framework or their own cultural identity, because I think that we need to recognize that we share this space, we share our classrooms with so many individuals. And so we really need to have an understanding of ourselves and constantly reflecting on our own awareness and understanding of the cultural lens that we are bringing into our spaces. Because without doing the personal work and without doing the self work, we can miss things that are happening in the spaces that, we have and that we share with students. And so I think the personal work, the personal reflective work is really crucial and a really important first step in this process.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think we have to be really intentional about the structures that we put in place so that young people have the ability to feel, for instance, advisory structures. So what does that look like? How are, what time is spent in the beginning of the year creating agreements together, or a social contract, or so that people have, they feel that there's structure in place so that there are possibilities for freedom, and freedom to speak their truth, freedom to take off their masks and really share who they are as their whole self. And so when we have, even though sometimes the word structure has a lot of, negative connotation, I think that we need the structures in order to create safe support for one another and connection amongst our students. And advisory is one of those places. So what might that look like to have an advisory where, everyone has the opportunity to be seen and heard every day, and that allows for students and adults to really check themselves in regards to, do I really know my students? Do I really know, do they know each other? And getting beyond conversations about what did you do this weekend, or what, those actually create inequities. Like, so what's your plan for this weekend, or what on Monday, the Monday check-in about what you do on this weekend. I've really tried to challenge some folks who are really diehard about that question, that really actually creates inequities and really can be damaging to relationships. So really getting at questions that give insight into who we are as individuals and honor one another.
Can I ask, I have two follow-up questions. One is to Lindsay, and then the other one is to Jeannie. And I guess, Lindsay, one of the questions that I have is, in our identity work, when we were talking about the PLP, And you just mentioned like speaking your truth and this identity, but also this identity within a community. A lot of the work that PLP Pathways has done is about, you know, learning about your students, but kind of in a one-to-one context. Like, how does a teacher know their students? And I'm just wondering if there's exercises or frameworks or questions we can be asking to see if we can build stronger identities or understanding of identities within a community context. Because what you just talked about, like that Monday meeting, that question, I haven't really even thought about it that way. Do you know what I mean? And so you say that, and then I'm like, holy cow, I never even thought about it that way as an educator. And then I guess my other question is to Jeannie, when you were talking about like biases, like what biases do we have? Is there a framework or a structure that could lead educators through the questions? Because we talked about language. We talked about like structure, advisory structures. We talked about what we read. And so is there like a framework or a list of things that I should be asking myself that would help me determine where my biases are and how those might come out in my classroom?
Would you like Jeannie to go first, or would you like me to go first?
I'm just curious.
I might forget the question, so let me just, I'll respond, and then Jeannie can respond to the second question. So I think what I heard you ask is, how might we build on the identity work in order for us to truly feel that we can be our true authentic selves, and our students can also feel that as well? And I would say that it requires time, and it's not just writing your PLP bio. You know, like, what is that? It's writing a bio on your PLP is awesome as a culmination maybe of a lot of work that you've done together, both individually and as a group, to get to know one another, to really dive into. There's so much literature and poetry and different experiences that you can have to really explore these ideas around identity. I think so. Providing the time, spending time in every year, all the time. I mean, but really, it starts, I know, in the beginning of the school year, especially because we need to put those structures in place and create agreements together with our young people and talk about what those agreements mean and what they look like and sound like and feel like. And it requires time, and it's really valuable time that, to me, feels like you spend the time doing that, and then that gets woven into all the learning experiences throughout the year, because folks feel comfortable and safe sharing. And when I said speak your truth, it's like really be your authentic self instead of putting up walls, and being able to be an advocate for yourself and feel a sense of like personal power as well. So I don't have like specific, I mean, I could certainly list a whole lot of specific ideas but definitely, just to me, the biggest piece is the time. Like, that is essential. I mean, just slowing down and spending time getting to know one another, and it's more profound than actually working on communication skills with other human beings. Like, I think that could be way more important in life than, a lot of the other pieces that we feel, take up a lot of our time in school. So, learning how to engage in conversation and dialogue with one another is, to me, one of the most important skills.
Can I just jump in really quick, Don, about that? Because we had a kiddo that was moving off of our team, and we wanted to celebrate him in a way and show him that we appreciated who he was. And instead of just focusing it on him, we wanted a way to acknowledge all of our attributes and all the things that we bring to our classroom every day. And so I had the students like write down characteristics or attributes that they value in one another. And then we just made word clouds out of those words. And it ended up sort of being like a flag that we put in our room that reminds, the words that popped out the most were accepting and kind and loving. And there was just some really powerful words that ended up emerging from our collective attributes. And it was halfway through the, it was 2 months ago or whatever it was, but it was another touchstone back to kids were surprised to see what others see in them. They didn't know that, oh, people see me as a go-to person, and they didn't know that. So it's not necessarily that equity component, but it is that culture, that like community, and the things that we contribute to a group that might be there.
Thank you.
I'm going to come back to this question of a framework. And I think what you're asking is, how can we as educators, as adults in the world, become, what are some tools we can use to become aware of things we might not consider? And so less of a framework, but I'm thinking about how hard it can be as a member of a dominant group, to how easy it is to be blind to the experiences of people who are marginalized. And so one tool I can share is a list of common social identities. Because when you're asked to consider, so for example, a place I might be blind might have to do with age or with ability, my bodily ability. Because I don't have a disability, I can be really blind to the experience of somebody who does. And so what this work really is for me is about empathy for others and how I might step into their shoes and see the world from their perspective. So Lindsay's example, if I can step in the shoes of a learner who is struggling with poverty and doesn't have a lot of resources in their life, and think about what it might be like for them to come back and talk about their weekend, I can have empathy for that experience and think of questions that might be more inclusive for all learners. And so I think the other thing I would stress in this is that it's never work that's going to be done, right? That now we're thinking about gender in a different way than we were, say, 20 years ago. And so I might need to rethink whether I say ladies and gentlemen in the classroom, and I might use folks instead. And I want to move us along because I think there is something about us recognizing our own implicit bias that's necessary to that next step, which is being able to identify the bias in policies and practices beyond our classrooms. And so an example of that, and that audit idea again, is to collect data around who gets busted for dress code infractions. And if the the data shows us that 90% of dress code infractions are committed by girls, we need to rethink our dress code because it means our dress code is sexist, right? And if we're looking at who gets in-school suspensions, and if 90% of those kids in in-school suspension also receive free reduced lunch, we need to think about what's going on there and get beneath that data. And so there's this concept of disproportionality. And if a disproportionate number of people from a certain group are experiencing a policy in a certain way, there's something wrong with the policy. Any thoughts on that, or any places you've seen that show up?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Jeannie, because what ends up happening when, especially around the dress code policies, I know when I, as an educator, it gets into it's incredibly sexist and body shaming for young girls, especially young adolescents whose bodies are rapidly changing, and they're trying to find clothes, that both express who they are and make them feel good, but also cover up their bodies that are rapidly changing. So I appreciate you bring that up. And then I also think about, like, okay, there's policies, but then there's like structures in our institutions, like, why are schools still giving kids detention? Like, what purpose is detention serving for kids? And I heard you, Dawn, say, like, maybe you didn't say this on the webinar, maybe we just had this before the webinar, that, the same kids are ending up in detention. So, like, let's look at that when we think about data, and Jeannie started off with, like, let's do some auditing of, systems or our own practices. Who's in detention and why, and what purpose is detention serving? And why do we even have systems like that? What is the purpose of detention? So I would even take it a step further back. I mean, and that is a policy piece, I guess I would say, around discipline. But why are those systems still in existence?
And I just want to add to that. I totally agree with what Lindsay's saying, but I also think that what Jean is saying about digging a little bit deeper on the data. So not only, when I look at the kids who have detention, mostly it's young men, right? But then if you were to dig deeper, are those young men who are on plans of some sort, or are those young men who are on the free and reduced lunch? And as Lindsay alluded to, what is the purpose? Like, they would, if it was me, I would feel trapped by a system that was completely unfair, and there wouldn't be anything about that would motivate me. It's like a fear, carrot and stick type thing. And so one thing I really liked about what Jeannie just said is digging deeper on the data and collecting it over time. But I also feel like I read the article Voices of Vermont, which I can post, and they talk about how in-school suspensions are an indicator of future school difficulty and dropout rate. And that directly influences how, I read that article 2.5 weeks ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And so, and it's influencing how I'm managing behaviors in my class, right? Because if that's the outcome, I think that can really influence our practice. And so how do we continue to, to take those measures and make it a more equitable system? And again, I don't have the answer, but the idea of data seems really good. And Jeannie, thank you for mentioning that idea of disproportionality. I think that's very important.
I'd like to also mention, sorry, just to interject, but that there's some data that's already out there that that when youth have the opportunity to actually look at, like the YRBS data, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data, and think about what are, how are people feeling in their school community, or what are the choices they're making. There's some really powerful data that's already out there, and young people should be looking at that to be the the kind of the fuel to spark the change. And then also, and if that's not, if the questions aren't reflected in data that's already out there, I think we need to ask young people to create the questions. What is really, what are they curious about? What are they, wondering? What is equitable to them? And then, let's go there and then collect data from their, peer-to-peer, and also with the adults, and then involve the young people in analyzing the data and then making change.
I totally agree with you, and I appreciate thinking about this as a systems and structures conversation, because I think that's where inequities live. It's not about fixing kids or it's fixing this thing. It's really about designing structures and systems in a way, and policies in a way that they're designed equitably. And at the same regard, it's designing ways and structures for students to provide that feedback and have authentic voice. But it's also on the adults to have, I think you were asking earlier, Don, about, what is the framework or the checklist? I think it's also about having listening routines. How are we listening to what's being said around us? What are our thinking routines as the adults who have the power to create the structures and the systems and ask the questions? How are we listening to those around us? And I think back to what you were saying about using models such as advisory to be a structure to get some of that data from students. And so I think all these pieces really work together.
I feel like we're moving in this direction. By the way, I also want to say that there's great data just in what books do you teach, what topics you teach, and whether or not those are reflective of our society at large, or whether in many cases we teach primarily books by white authors. And it feels important to address that. But I also want to move us in this direction that I feel like we're already heading, which is one of the pieces that's been really important to me in my work, is creating brave and generous spaces for educators to challenge their own and each other's biases and assumptions. For me, that looks like school reform initiative work, collaborative practices work, using structures and protocols. And lately I've been using color brave space agreements from Fake Equity to create places that aren't just safe, but are brave enough that we can sort of poke a little bit at systems and find the inequities. And that's been super important because I don't think this work can be done alone. I think it needs to be done in community. We can't see what we can't see. I need you to help me see what I can't see. And so I'm wondering about other people's experiences with creating those kind of spaces.
Would you be willing to talk more just about like what you mean when you say a color brave space? What is
I'm going to look them up right now. Color brave space agreements come from this great organization called Fake Equity, and their mission is to call out when equity is sort of used falsely, when that term is used shallowly. And so their acknowledgement is that norms sometimes norms perpetuate the inequities that we're trying to get away from. They keep the people who are always safe. And so when we create a norm that says, that's about safety, it usually ends up keeping sort of the dominant culture safe. Color brave safe agreements ask us to do a little more work to hold multiple sort of norms, because cultures come with norms, right? And so, for example, put relationships first is one of their norms, or one of their agreements, I guess. Keep focused on our common goal, and often that common goal is to address race. And so it's really easy for us to talk about things other than race, but that sort of centers race and says, you know what, it's uncomfortable, but we're still going to talk about it. And we're not going to say, well, let's talk about class instead. We can also talk about class, but we're not going to deflect to that.
Got it.
Look for learning, be kind and brave. Those are the color brave space agreements. There are a few more. And if you Google it, it'll take you right to a nice blog post from Fake Equity, and we can link that out later too. So that's an example. Another example, so that can look like coming together and tuning your curriculum with this notion of, does it represent all my learners? Is it multicultural and culturally responsive? Does it provide opportunities for kids to see themselves? Is one example. Another example that several of us are doing across Vermont are there are several groups doing becoming anti-racist white educators groups. That's another link we can put on, and there are resources for starting to have conversations about race in an affinity group with white people, where you're in small groups really exploring your edges in terms of bias around race. And that's another example. I would say that on Twitter, the Clear the Air chats are another example of a place where you can sort of grow your own edges in terms of your bias and assumptions. And I think that's been some of the most powerful learning I've done in the last 8 years, is in my intentional learning community, using collaborative practices principles to really examine our work together in my former school, and use each other as sounding boards, as people who can call us out and in on our practices, and where we might be blind to our inequitable impact.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeannie.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else in communities that help them identify bias and assumptions? Anybody else had this experience?
I can share, we at both on our administrative team, but then in our larger LSSU team, have been really working on developing some shared language around helping each other have conversations about bias. And we are using, and I know a lot of schools around Vermont right now are using the Equity Literacy Framework by Paul Gorski. It's, you know, we're seeing it over and over again. And we selected that partially because we knew that a lot of our Vermont neighbors were also using that same language, because I think as we're doing this work in community, there is so much power in having shared language, because it creates a neutral space to have conversations and dig in. And so that's, I think building that shared language is really important.
I love Gorski's work, and I think there's so much power in that equity literacy framework. And he asked a question years ago when I saw him speak that I still sit with. And that question is, how does our school system or our school systems, how do they bestow unearned privilege on some and unearned obstacles or hardship on others? And that's a question that can really help me look at systems differently.
Mm-hmm.
Mara, you named earlier an equity trap. Something I always think of as an equity trap. Like if I see it show up in policies or practices, I'm like, that's like the red alarm goes off. And that was any program or curriculum or initiative that seeks to fix people instead of fix systems is an equity trap to me. It's likely to be an equity trap. A couple of others are these kids can't. That, to me, my alarm bells go off. That's a sign of inequitable practice if you think kids can't learn. Gorski talks a lot about celebrating diversity, rah, 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 without addressing actual inequitable practices or racism or sexism or homophobia. If you're all about the celebration, but you can't name the negative impacts of inequity, then that's a problem, right? That's a trap. And as a librarian, one of the things that shows up for me is calling some books or materials sensitive or sophisticated or too grown up. So that often what gets thrown into that category is books about the LGBTQ community, or often books that get called out in my own experience, in my own school system, were books where two boys kiss, even though we wouldn't have a problem with a boy and a girl kissing in a book in an elementary school library. Or George, about a transgendered fourth grader, is a book that might be too sensitive, right? But that's perpetuating inequity when we say that we can't talk about those things. And so that's another example. And I'm curious about the equity traps that you all have experienced, or things that sort of send your alarm bells ringing.
I think one of the big ones that we keep mentioning is the language that we use around kids and around learners, and what the implications of those those terms can have, and how teachers talk about teaching and talk about how, even how their day is going in a way that kids can hear. And I just think, again, this idea of, what language are we using, that ladies and gentlemen, right? Like, how do you have somebody maybe point that out to you that, hey, maybe that is sort of an outdated term, or maybe that's exclusive, right? And so thinking about those types of languages. And I guess just right now I'm kind of on the disciplinary system, and I don't know if this is an equity trap or not, but I'm not sure. I would have to think more about it, but just the way we're trying to impose behavior on kids without doing some of the identity work and some of the community and relationship work. And I just wonder, how that's impacting kids. I don't know if that's an equity trap or not, but it's something I'm thinking about quite often these days.
I guess I think about, we're just in the throes of our personal interest projects, our PIPs. And as a school, we've just been talking a lot about how we want to honor what students, what interests they have, and how they want to pursue their interests, and how the goal for that has great intentions, but it sets up limitations for kids, and it's a trap. There are kids that don't have the resources or don't have the support in their families, and then other kids have all these other resources and supports. And I've contributed to it, so I have this real. It just brings up quite a bit about how we're trying to celebrate flexible pathways and trying to celebrate this personal learning plans, and what's this underlying idea of inequity that's inherent in that.
Yeah, I would, I know that you and I have talked about that a lot, Meg, around
Yeah.
and, and like, first of all, how do young people know what their interests are if they haven't really had the life experiences to expose them? So that right there you have like an equity gap, because you have those kids who come from families that have had many life experiences and have access to a lot of resources and extracurricular activities, and then we have students that don't have those same access, and so what is the purpose of the PIP? Is it to get kids really excited about something, or is it to like, I don't know. So I would say, like, I would really look at that and say, what are we trying to get out of this PIP here, this personal interest project, and how are we going to support every single learner in ensuring that they have the access to the materials, resources, community partners. I mean, that in itself, it could be a huge equity bonus if everyone has, like, before the PIP, you do a lot of thinking about, who am I, who am I as a learner, who am I as an individual, what are things that I enjoy, what are things that I don't enjoy, what are, then trying out experiences together. So exposing, our young people to different types of learning experiences, and then saying, putting all, again, it goes back to the structures. Like, if we just say it's time for the PIP, let's celebrate, and just dive on into your interest. How are we really supporting all of our young people in truly diving into a passion of theirs? And so, again, it goes back to those structures. What do we do? All those steps before the PIP in order to ensure that it is equitable. And
I think I was thinking about it too earlier today when we were talking about it with who are our student leaders or our student leadership groups that we look to inform, like, oh, let's ask this group of students to get some feedback on a policy or an activity or whatever it is. And that group may not represent that right there is another inequity trap.
Can I just mention one more thing too? And while Lindsay was talking, I'm also thinking about grain size, and I'm going down to the real classroom level here. When we're designing units and we're thinking about essential questions that we want to be asking, how do we make sure that our essential questions are inclusive for all of our learners? And then how, again, as Jeannie mentioned, how do we audit our questions so that they're inclusive? But then how do we audit the materials that we're using to help kids answer those questions, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's just a grain size issue of how do I use this lens when I'm doing either identity activities, or I am thinking about classroom activities or content and curriculum. How do I start asking these questions at a real basic level, so that what we build is built on a foundation of equity, or at least considerations for that. So anyway, that's just a thought that I had while you guys were discussing this. I do want to point out that this is a really rich conversation, and we have probably about 8 or 9 minutes left, and I'm wondering where folks want to go. We have a resource recommendation section. We also have some initial strategies for addressing inequities. And I guess, Jeannie, I'm going to ask you, what do you think, based on this conversation, what do you think is most important for folks who are viewing it or who are going to access it? What do you think is most important for us to kind of culminate with or conclude with?
Oh, that's so hard. I could have this conversation for days. Before I'm going to think about that on the back burner, on the simmer, while I call one of the resources we provided is my favorite Gorski article is called 5 Stereotypes About Poor Families and Education. And the reason I think that one in particular is important is because we as educators, by virtue of being educators, are middle class. And we have enormous blind spots about families and their investment in education based on our own sort of ideas about what it looks like to be an engaged parent or guardian. And so I just think that that article, I actually come from working poor family, and that article still made me brush up against my own bias and assumptions I made about families. And so I really highly recommend that one. I think it's super important. And then the other thing I'm going to do before we're out of time is give a little shout out to this book, The Benefits of Being an Octopus by Anne Braden. Anne Braden is a Vermont author, and this book is stepping into the shoes of 7th grader Zoe, who's reckoning with poverty in a really real way. And so it's an empathy builder for young people for sure. But I am a fan of reading young adult and middle grades literature for teachers, because I think that they're empathy building. And so this is a book we're going to read at MGI, and Anne Braden is going to come and talk with us about it. And so I'm just putting a little shout out about that. And another book, We Got This, by Cornelius Minor. And he does a lot of what, Don, you just brought up, which is give strategies for how to listen deeply to young people in order to build curriculums that meet their needs. And so it's a book all about equity. And so that's my other shout out. And now your last question, your question was, how do we spend the rest of this time? And I'm not sure, because there's so many things. But Lindsay and I had were asked to think about asking you all these questions. And so maybe I'll ask the first one and leave Lindsay the second one. So the first one is, how is personalized learning a way to address some inequities?
Well, I'll start, just because I've had conversations with kids in the last 2 weeks who are struggling. And I think personally, when you're talking, we always talk about this on PLP Pathways. It's about building relationships, and it's about knowing kids deeply. And sometimes it can be really hard, but I think when you have some of these resources, or even the conversations we had today, that hugely influences the conversations I'm directly having with kids. And I think it makes me more empathetic and more understanding. And that allows me to make better book I had a kid today ask me for a book recommendation for the over the break. And these conversations help me make better recommendations and help make me know my kids better and build stronger relationships, so that I can help them by creating more equitable learning environments. So really, again, I don't have the answers, but these types of conversations are hugely informative to me in building relationships with kids who may be marginalized by the system.
I was just going to add about just coming off of parent-teacher conferences, and just having had student-led portfolio conferences, and just having that opportunity to sit with kids and celebrate their successes, and then identify goals that they want to end the year strong with, and just having that that community of either parent or guardian, teacher and student, I think helps us personalize, and it helps us bolster kids to see themselves as at the center of their learning. And I don't ever want to lose those opportunities to sit down and celebrate kid work together with kids. I think that identifies their personal growth.
And I can piggyback off of that too. I think, the PLPs offer such a great way of building and reinforcing identity and agency in students. And going back to a couple of points I mentioned earlier, I think it's most important that we're working with these students to develop goals and find evidence of their growth toward goals, but providing everybody with meaningful and authentic learning experiences throughout the school day, so they can actually have experiences with these evidences to show growth, versus just expecting them to, hopefully have it outside of school and have the same experiences. So I think that's a big piece to the puzzle, is not only this identity work and goal setting and finding evidence of growth, but providing those meaningful and authentic learning opportunities when we have the students here with us in school.
I think relevance is an excellent equity strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, Jeannie, that it's like we need to be asking our students what they care about, and then designing our curriculum and our, educational experiences around that. It's because that's equitable in itself. And when we make a lot of assumptions, and we also I guess we just make a lot of assumptions about what kids might, need or want. And I think we need to open up to more dialogue, back to that dialogue piece. And I was just thinking about with personalized learning, I mean, it could open up the door to so much, so many equitable experiences when it is done in a way that you are really looking at the systems within it again, like, how do kids get out of the classroom, like into the community? Like, so we want to have community partners. Well, we can't just, it can't just be the kids who have parents that can drive them there. How are we all going to get out? And then there's policies in our schools that prevent us from actually taking kids out of the building, and so we have to, those are the pieces that we have to disrupt. So if we want kids out in the community, making change, connecting with partners, seeing themselves as members of, as members of the citizens of their community, then we need to look at the practices and policies that are getting in the way and then say, how can we make change? Because truly, if we want every learner to have a personalized learning plan, flexible pathways to demonstrate their proficiencies by graduation, then we need to like get out of the way a little bit, number one. And also we need to be changing our policies, because there are too many policies in place right now that are creating major inequities. And that's my soapbox.
Maura?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo what Lindsay was saying. And I think Act 77 is really this gift that's been given to us to reimagine what a structure and system might look like in a school. And as we are designing and as we are building these structures and systems, we also need to remember that we need to keep checking in with them and asking questions, because without checking them and without, reflecting on them, that system will want to morph back into the previous system that was inequitable. And so we have this opportunity to be redesigning and reconsidering and considering policies about how we get students out into the community and building partnerships, right? That we have the ability, the space has been created to do those things. And so we need to be designing from an equity stance, and then also continually checking in on what we have designed to make sure that it is truly what we envisioned and is not sort of going back to what our previous systems have looked like.
Well, I mean, obviously we started this conversation saying how this was the beginning of the discussion. I don't think we, there's so much here, as Jeannie mentioned, and so much to talk about. I do want to just kind of wrap up by mentioning that the Middle Grades Institute, which is from June 24th to June 29th, will be tackling a lot of these issues. I also know that there are some activities or events that are happening around the state, and I want to let Lindsay just mention hers, right? That Power 2 conference, and there's a couple other ones. And then we're going to sign off, but I want to thank Jeannie Phillips so much for participating in this call. It's just your expertise and understanding is fantastic, and what a great resource for us. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this, because you've got me thinking, and it's just been really great. But speaking of what's going on, if folks have things on their agenda that they want to recommend events, again, I'm going to start with Lindsay. I know there's things going on. Lindsay, what's happening May 1st?
Well, tomorrow, for anybody who can just jump right, on it, the Higher Ed Collaborative it was part of kind of a 3-part series. It's called Whose Country Is This? Race, Racism, and Refugee Status in America. And then the follow-up final component to that is on May 15th. Paul Gorski started the year with a 2-day, and then this will be a final piece of his strategies for erasing the opportunity gap. And there's been a lot of shout outs to Gorski and his equity literacy piece. So he'll be back. And then Power Squared Summit is on May 1st. And there is still opportunities for young people to it's a very easy RFP process to present. It's a youth driven conference, and that it's all youth adult partners presenting about work that's occurring at their school. And so that's in Fairleigh at Lake Maury Resort, and I think the link is there. But if people have students that want to present at a conference and share the work that they're doing, there's still room to present.
Awesome. Anybody else have events that they want to point out? Okay, again, just the Middle Grades Institute happening June 24th through June 29th is going to tackle and readdress a lot of these issues. Again, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to start the discussion on this very important issue. It is sunny out. I hope you can go out and enjoy it. And again, Jeannie Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everybody has a good afternoon. Our next webinar is going to be on May 16th. That'll be webinar number 9, and we hope to see you then. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for your ideas. Take care.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.